Friends, I have been meaning to do this for a long time. It has been going in the back of my mind how the history we are taught, unless we do a deep dive, is all about Central Asian invasions into Bharat. Be it the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughal dynasty, then the British Empire. We are basically overwhelmingly in our school books and in the general discourse taught how we were defeated, how we were ruled by foreign invaders. At best, it is said those invaders became a part of India. But the invasion and we are a defeated people, that narrative has been peddled by, I would say, leftist distortorians, as well as people who are either useful idiots or suffer from some amount of insecurity complexes because they want to portray the narrative that we always lost. There are 2 points to that. First, we are not an 800-year-old civilization, and even in that 800 years, large parts of India, Bharat, were ruled by people whom I would call Sanatan Dharmis. Secondly, Britishers had a very clear agenda. They were at no given time too many Britishers in India, so they had to peddle the narrative that we have taken over from people who were already invaders, and that is the fate of this land. Well, the reality is the fate of this land is glorious, and we are not an 800-year-old civilization. Even by the most conservative estimates, we are at least 10,000 year old. And I'm saying by the most conservative estimates. So, what is 800 years? That also in parts, barely 8% of our history, which everybody admits. So, 92% was clean victories. 800 years also, large parts were ruled by people, as I already told you, who were Indic people. So this thing to be discussed is very important. And I heard a video which made me reach out to Abhijit Chavda and request him for his time because he is an excellent person to discuss both the hard power of Bharat as well as the soft power, because soft power is equally important. US rules some ways by hard power and lot of places just by soft power, the culture they have. So we will discuss the glory of Bharatiya kings, the glory of Bharat. If you are joining for the first time, please subscribe to the channel and join in. I do a live every day at 10 p.m. and sometimes I have fabulous guests like Abhijit today. So without further ado, I would just welcome you, Abhijit. I was reading you are a physicist to a historian to a public speaker that we know, writer, into technology. So you cover a enormous spectrum. But what is your true first love?
My true first love has always been physics. That's who I am at the core. I've always been a physicist for the past 25 plus years, but I've also always had a great deal of interest in history and related fields like geopolitics and all that. So I've been reading about these subjects for decades, since I was a little child, basically. That's why I do consider myself a historian, even though I don't have an official degree. But I think I can hold my own against any historian, at least in the subject that we are talking about.
Thank God for that. If you had an official degree, you would be talking about how Mughal Empire was the greatest empire controlling the entire Bharat.
Precisely.
So that is what is to be taught to you officially. So thank you. So start wherever you want to start because you know the topic and I have discussed the topic. So of our victories or whichever empire you want to start with.
So like you said in the introduction, we have basically all of us, we have grown up with a certain idea of India in our mind. And this idea of India has been inculcated by our education system, and it's been reinforced by the media and the government itself, the establishment. And this idea of India teaches us that we ought to be thankful for the past 800 so years of invasions, because these invasions have essentially given us a great deal of progress. We have become more progressive, more modern, and we have left behind our primitivity and backwardness. So that's what the idea of India tells us. Now, the truth is that India, like you said, it's at least 10,000 years old. The genetic evidence says that it's 50 to 60,000 years old. We have the same genetics going on for the past 50, 60,000 years. And the archaeological record shows cultural continuity for at least 10,000 years, going back to the very dawn of the so-called Harappan era of our civilization. So we are a very ancient, we are the most ancient known civilization and the most ancient surviving civilization in human history. Absolutely. Now, when it comes to invasions, we are taught that we have always been invaded, like you said, and that we have always lost to these invaders. The truth is that History tells us something very different. It tells us that we have been sending migrations and invasions out of India for thousands and thousands of years. Now, in some cases, there is incomplete evidence, but in some cases, we have very sufficient and definite evidence. Genetics tells us, genetics gives us very clear evidence of it cannot be basically challenged, because the science of genetics is precise. So, for example, in the Rig Veda, in the Puranas, there are mentions of Indian kings going westwards and north of the Himalayas and founding kingdoms in what is now Central Asia. So, what we had was that we had a number of Indianized Indic kingdoms in Central Asia, and those kings and those people who lived there all claimed descent from Lord Rama and other Vedic and pre-Vedic and post-Vedic kings of India. So we have had a long history of populating and enculturing Central Asia, right? For example, there is a Vedic text called the Bodhayana Shrota Sutra, which talks about a migration to the west. It talks about a Vedic king called Amavasu, who went westwards out of India, and his people are the Gandhara people, the Parshva people, and the Aratha people. Now we know very well who the Gandhara are. That's just Afghanistan, which was always a part of India. Parshva again is very clear. They are the Persians, right? The Persians are the Parshva people. The word Persia comes from the word Parshva. So they were the people who used the Parshu or the battle axe in warfare. So those are the descendants of Mother India. And again, the Aratha people are speculated to be the people of around Anatolia or Armenia, because over there is Mount Ararat, and there is a mythical king called Amasya, which sounds just like Amavasu. So there is clearly a correlation there of Indians going and conquering lands to the west. And we also had the Mitanni. I mean, there is hard evidence of Sanskrit speaking Indo Aryan royalty in Anatolia, the Mitanni kingdom, because the oldest written evidence of Sanskrit is found in Syria, and it is a
Hmm.
younger form of Sanskrit. It is not Rigvedic Sanskrit. It is a post
Okay.
Rigvedic form of Sanskrit. So clearly, this migration out of India and this conquest
And
of Anatolia happened after much after the Rig Veda was written. So we have so many evidences like that of Indians conquering lands thousands of kilometers to the west of India. And when you talk about the north of India, the region of Tibet and the present day so-called Xinjiang region of China,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
has always been an Indianized region.
Hmm.
The lingua franca of this region was Gandhari for centuries. Gandhari is an Upper language which was typically spoken in northern India, Afghanistan, that area, and it was
Hmm.
also spoken north of the Himalayas. The city of Kashgar, for example, was earlier known as Kashinagar, right? That is one of the major cities in the Xinjiang region of China, present day Xinjiang region of China. And other cities are known to have been founded by Indians during the Mauryan times.
Hmm.
Cities to the north, it is cities along the so-called Silk Road in the Tarim River Basin region. So once again, that is an evidence of Indians migrating north of the Himalayas, making those lands their own, and basically creating Indianized kingdoms there. Now let's talk about the Kushans. The Kushans were originally an invader people, right? They invaded India from the north of the Himalayas, but they were very much Indic. They just assimilated harmoniously in India. There is no record of any religious or cultural friction between the Kushans and the Indians, right? Because they were the same people. And one
Hmm.
of our greatest emperors of all time is Kanishka the Great, who was a Kushan. Now, what you see in the map is to some extent Kanishka's empire. The
Hmm.
true extent of his empire ranged from the shores of the Aral Sea to the shores of the Caspian Sea. So that is the heartland of Central Asia
Hmm.
and west of Iran. So
Hmm.
that's how large his empire was. It stretched all the way there. It also encompassed the whole of the so-called Xinjiang region of China, present-day China, the Tarim River Basin region, and much of northern India. So that is a vast, enormous empire. I mean, and Kanishka, the the thing is that people say he was an invader, he was a foreigner, but Kanishka did more than anybody else to promote Indian culture. He was a vigorous champion of Indian culture. He did more than anybody else to spread Indian culture outside of India's boundaries. He sent thousands of religious and cultural missions into China. And it is because of his efforts that China is today the world's greatest Buddhist population.
Hmm.
And this culture spread not just into China, it spread to Tibet, to Mongolia, to Southeast Asia, to the Koreas, and into Japan. It spread all across Eastern Asia, also down south. So the impact of Kanishka is immense. I mean, he's one of the greatest Indians of all time, at least of
Hmm.
the past 2000 years.
Hmm.
And Kanishka created this empire by conquest. He conquered these lands. I mean, he was a vigorous military campaigner. He he participated in a number of military campaigns. He conquered all these lands so far away from what we now consider to be India. So
Hmm.
all that was Indianized. It was Indian territory once upon a time, and we are not taught even 1% of this in our history textbooks because they don't want us to know how great we have been in the past. So that's just one example of Indian kings conquering lands outside of what we now consider to be India. Just
Abhijit,
one.
before I go, see, that is why I said the basic concept is in any psychological warfare, when a foreigner has to go on to show you as defeated people, to erase your history. The minute they erase your history, and the minute a school kid reads only about Central Asia invasions, you do not read about Cholas, the Mauryans, the Kanishkas, and that you had captured China to the Caspian Sea, large parts of Central Asia, many, many countries today. It's not one country today. After USSR breakup, there are, I don't know how many countries, 10, 12, 15, whatever. So that is how much land you had captured. But if you read about that, then you know that you are not only governing, you are taking your governance outside, you are taking your culture outside, you are taking your religion outside. Why is it that the land which gave birth to all these great religions and these religions went out, they would have not gone out without the hard power? It cannot happen. You cannot have a religion going out without some amount of hard power. Then it can spread based on its soft power. That's just basic, very, very basic thing. The Islamic religion spread all over the world along with its hard power in those regions. Christianity spread over pagans because the kings started going. So there was hard power, and then yes, you can do conversion, you can do persuasion, you can do forced conversions, whatever you may call it. But you will need to be in the position to be able to do it. That is hard power, and that is what any place you see Buddhism and any place you see Bali, you see such strong Hindu culture. That didn't happen accidentally in one region. That had to be hard power behind it, which took it there to some degree. And that is why I'm discussing this, because people need to learn the true history. And anybody watching this, please do share it also. Tell people that we have conquered first. This is Kushan Empire is what era, Vijit? If you would just tell us what
It's
time it is.
around it's around 1900 years ago, roughly, plus or minus 100 200 years. So
Hmm.
around the Kushans first entered India around 100 years BCE, and they were very much in power until 200 300 CE. So it's an era of around 400 years when they had really great emperors like
Hmm.
Kanishka, like Vasudeva the first, who kicked the Chinese out of Central Asia.
Hmm.
So it's not just Kanishka. There is an emperor called Vasudeva who was most likely Kanishka's grandson.
Hmm.
He essentially evicted the Chinese out of Central Asia using military power, using military force. So it's not just Kanishka. We had another emperor called Vasudeva I who did something very similar. So we had such great emperors. Now the thing is, we have to clearly understand the distinction between hard power and soft power. I mean, we in India are obsessed with soft power and we don't really understand hard power either. But we don't know what is the definition of soft power, what is hard power. So let me just go into that, just quickly. So soft power is like you have a Twitter account and you have 100,000 followers, and whatever you tweet, your followers will look at it. They may take it seriously. They may perhaps believe it. They may perhaps 1%, 2% may take some action. So that is soft power. It means you have influence. That you have an audience. That is soft power. Hard power is that I have 1,000 heavily armed, highly trained soldiers, and they will obey me instantaneously without question. That is called hard power. It means I can get things done out there on the streets. So that is the difference between soft power and hard power. Hard power means you can get things done. You can change the world within seconds if you want to. That's called hard
I,
power. And there
I,
is no soft power without hard power.
I find it very interesting because you have gone into definitional, as we used to have in college debates, a definitional challenge and a definitional clause that refers to define the subject. And it's very nice you picked it up. I would say it like this: soft power is anybody watching this YouTube, any place in the world, is soft power. You could hear it. It is at least something you like. That is why you have subscribed to the channel. And you have some affinity for what sort of conversations we are having. How much you act on it is your choice, but that's broadly the soft power. Hard power would be what I would say an IPS officer doing an investigation, or a DC anywhere in India, in a simple non-military terms. That is hard power. His order, because he has the force and sanction of law. If it's a lawful order, you have to obey. That is hard
Correct.
power. Ishkaran, you
Yes.
could say, "Hey, Ishkaran nonsense bol raha hai." To a DC, you can't say nonsense bol raha hai. Aajkal, especially in Disaster Management Act, you would be in jail. So that is, I would say, but this hard power cannot, the soft power cannot exist without some amount of hard power being its seed, germinating it. That is why, very interestingly, we are today also having some issues in the border with China. Remember our history. So many people who feel defeated. We have driven them out various times. You will only talk about 62 war. Talk about other things. That is the whole purpose. China was not in my mind when I was doing this talk, but it's a very topical thing. Please remember your history. If you forget your history, your victories, only hear about your defeat. Even today's political discourse, you see any political party, they try to spin a campaign that we are winning. Why? Because if people believe you are winning, your chances of winning increase. And not going into any political party, but that's the reason so much of money is spent on media. It increases your chances. And that is only when it's voting. When it's military, it increases your chances many times more. Why lose your life if you're not going to win? So anyways, yeah, Kushan Empire, as we're talking about.
So apart from the Kushan Empire, we had, like you said, the Chola Empire. It
Let
was
me just,
not just Chola.
because this is very important. Kushan was, we are up
Absolutely.
north. This is, we are
Up
doing
north.
now south. So every part of the world outside what was traditionally what you would call India today, we were reaching. See this? Yeah, please speak.
So once again, in this map, it doesn't show the entire extent of the influence of the Chola Empire. The Chola Empire essentially conquered Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Sri Lanka, uh, Indonesia, Java, Sumatra. It conquered Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and it went all the way to the Philippines. So that is how enormous this empire was at its greatest extent, and it had an immense amount of influence on the whole of Southeast Asia. The lifestyle, the culture, the languages, the names, the dynasties, the architecture, the way of dressing, everything that you see today in Southeast Asia has Indian influences. It has a layer of Indian influence below what you see today. For example, Indonesia is an Islamic country today. Officially, it's a Muslim country, but the prestige language in Indonesia is even today Sanskrit. And the names they give to their children are Sanskrit names. The former president of Indonesia was Megawati Sukarno Putri. Now, that is, I mean, I don't know in which language you think it is. It is Sanskrit. And there are so many other people today in Indonesia who are Muslims and who have Hindu names, who have Sanskrit names. So that's just one small example. And after the Chola dynasty waned in the 13th century onwards, the Indonesian Majapahit Empire reached its greatest peak, and that is the Indonesians of today considered to be the golden age of Indonesia. And the Majapahit Empire was a Hindu thalassocratic empire. It was a maritime empire. And in southern Vietnam, there was another kingdom called the Champa Kingdom, which was a Hindu Shaivite kingdom, which was a subsidiary state of the Chola Empire. And after the Chola influence waned, the Champa kingdom also became an empire. It also became a maritime empire. And what is now known as the South China Sea was always known as the Champa Sea, because the Champa Empire's military and especially the navy had full control over this region for centuries. China has never had any influence in the so-called South China Sea. It is the British who gave it the name South China Sea, and that's what the Chinese have picked up today to make their disproportionate claims to territory. So this was once again an Indianized Hindu empire. You will see hundreds of beautiful Shaivite temples and Nandi statues and Shivlingas in Vietnam, especially southern Vietnam. You will see the same in Cambodia. In the early 2000s, Thailand and Cambodia nearly went to war over a border temple. There is a temple on the border of Cambodia and Thailand. It is called the Priya Vihar temple, if I'm not mistaken. That has been in ruins for centuries. It is exactly on the border. Both countries claimed it, and they nearly went to war. There was a border incident. There were lots of soldiers who got shot. So that is how much they value their Indian culture. And it's something we don't value. If you go to Thailand today, once again, Thailand, like I said, it is today a Buddhist kingdom, a Buddhist country. But if you go to the airport in Bangkok, the Suvarna Bhumi airport, you will see an enormous tableau of the Samudra Manthan, which is, I would not consider it to be Buddhist. It's a Hindu mythological event, and that is depicted as a centerpiece, in the place of honor in that airport. So they seem to value their Indian influence and their Indian culture more than we do, because we don't have any statues of any of our gods, goddesses, or ancient events anywhere. So that's just one small example. Now, the Chola Empire, like I said, it conquered these areas militarily. They had one of the greatest and most powerful navies of the ancient world. And they conquered Java, Sumatra, they conquered various parts of Southeast Asia. And what they did was they would install princes over there to rule those regions, and those princes would intermarry with the locals, and after a couple of centuries they would just become like the locals. So if you look at the DNA over there in Indonesia or in Cambodia, you will see significant influences of Indian genetics there. And Indonesia is Indonesia. It is not Sinonesia or something else. It's Indonesia because of the Indian influence. So that's just one example of how India influenced Southeast Asia by doing military conquests initially.
Even today, the currency of Indonesia, the imagery on it. So it is when you are putting an image on your currency, which is obviously one of the most important things for any nation and any people, that itself shows what is the deep-rooted influence, subliminal influence, which you may not talk about, but it is in your bones because it was there for centuries. And the problem,
and it was not imposed by force. It was not imposed by force. See, India has never ever converted anybody to its religion. It just happened by assimilation and by percolation, right? In Hinduism was never imposed on anyone by force. Buddhism was never imposed on anybody by force. And the second thing is that we may have conquered, but we never indulged in colonialism. We never extracted wealth out of those conquered countries and lands. We enriched them. That is the principal difference between India and other conquering powers. India has been a conquering power in the past, a ginormous conquering power, but we never impoverished and destroyed other countries. That is something we have to understand.
And Abhijit, as you were saying, even Chola Empire, which people may not know, was one of the longest empires also. Longest not in the sense of area, longest in sense of how from when they first came to power till when they lost power. It was one of the longest ruling dynasties. Huge areas would go up and down over the years. So that is how long and how continuous your rule was. Not just 200 years or 250 years of part Mughal rule, which you read about all the time. This was centuries of rule. And as we were discussing, from China, one dynasty, other goes into Indonesia, the entire Far East they get into, and their offshoots then rule. The China Sea, as I didn't know that, thanks for that information, the China Sea was also basically controlled by an offshoot of a Hindu empire. Like Chola, and offshoots obviously happen when your military commanders become strong. That is, throughout history they will happen. As in today's context, I would say some leader becomes too strong, forms his independent party and becomes a chief minister. If the center becomes weak, which has happened with Congress many times, it may happen in other parties also. So that is historical process of power. And but it is offshoot was what? Again, Chola empires, again the culture, the language, the religion, the official court language, Sanskritized. Even today, the imagery of Samundar Manthan or on the Indonesian notes, all that shows what was the enormous extent of. One question I will ask, because you told me you are a self-trained historian. Why do you think this glorification? My view is that Britishers never wanted, Mughals didn't want it. But why do you think after independence, this glory, which we legitimately had, factually had, which is visible many times with what we call circumstantial evidence. This is even not circumstantial. There is no reason for Samundar Manthan to be there. Has not been taught in a proper manner in our official school books, because 90% of people get busy in work life, and only maybe not 90, 95 people get busy in whatever work life they have. And this is not something they will discuss in an ordinary course in such a grand manner, from north to China to Afghanistan to south to Far East. Why has this not been done? What do you think? When you picked up books, why did you not find it?
Right. So what happened in 1947, we have to understand what that is. It was the undemocratic transfer of power from one set of crooks to another set of crooks. And this was the pretense was that this is a democratic thing, but there was no election. It was just a blatant transfer of power. And the set of crooks who came to power in India because of the British largesse wanted to be in power by hook or by crook, and they had to keep the people impoverished, illiterate, and ignorant in order to continue ruling for decades. And that's precisely what we see. I mean, we lived in for decades in a condition of artificial scarcity. We lived in artificially induced poverty. The regime refused to industrialize and modernize the country, and the education system was tailor made to keep us basically in a state of amnesia. So we should not know our true history. The moment you know how great you were, you're going to ask yourself a simple question: why are we still not great? Why are we not able to go back to our natural state? And then the second question is, who's ruling us? Who's keeping us down? So this entire rigmarole, this entire charade of writing these fake history textbooks and all that, full of blatantly distorted history. This entire thing was done as part of a large plan to keep the Indians essentially ignorant about who they really are. And that's worked for like 50, 60 years. Even today, even when we have a government that we brought to power, we still have these history textbooks full of lies, and it's still not being revised. So I think it's really disappointing, but at least we can contribute something by talking about true history.
No, I will just add one point to it before I get into the Mauryan Empire and some other things. I wouldn't say they were crooks. I think it was also that when they got the power from the British had such a, some would be crooks, some would be genuine, but the British had such a enormous control over the hard power, the aspirational life. Everybody went to, the top ones went to study to England. And like today, I see so many people, US operates in its own interest. Sometimes it will be a friend of India, sometimes it will not be. But I see a crazy affinity for lifestyle in US. So many people across states want to migrate to US because they are thinking in terms of their own life, that it can be better in US. So I would think it is also that, as you said, the hard power of British mixed with the soft power of how they are democracy. Unless you have done a deep dive and thinking into these subjects like you have, so many politicians would not have. So at 47, I'm talking about. So I think it is a very complex issue. Not, some of them may want to do it also, but think that British way is the best way, because
Yes,
you
absolutely.
are 44, 50 years old living in a British glory environment. So even if you are not a crook, that environment where you have become a 50-year-old man, you don't change. So I think it became a very complex situation. My problem is not in the first 10 years. Industrialization should happen. My problem is after 1970 or 1975, when the generation changed and people who were teenagers came into power by 80. Why then it did not change? That is something which worries me. And if you ask me, the worry becomes a tsunami of worry, if I might use the term, when after 2014 you still don't do it. Now there are people who were not even born in 47 in power.
Yes.
So that is the most worrying. See, the degree of worry increases from 47 to 50. I can say, okay, you're under the influence. 60, it rises. 70. This time, that boggles my mind.
It is really indeed high time to reform things. I mean, this is just low hanging fruit. There will of
Hmm.
course be there will of course be lots of opposition and protest from the left wing. We know who they are, the
Hmm.
entire ecosystem. But if you are in power with such a brute majority, you've got to exercise that power. I mean, these people have always been in minority governments and they've done so many changes. The moment they come to power, for 6 months, they're going to make a lot of changes, which will take years to undo. So I think our side needs to learn how to exercise power, how to wield power, because it looks like we don't really understand what power is and how it's to be wielded. So that is one of the worries we have. I hope that as the years progress, sooner rather than later, we're going to see significant changes. And in case the government, see, the thing is now in the post-COVID world, the education system is more or less obsolete. everything is available online. If you need something, you go to YouTube or you go online, and you're going to get the answers in a few minutes or in a couple of hours. And you're not going to go to your NCERT textbooks and all that. Children are increasingly just bypassing all that and going straight to the global channels like YouTube and all that.
Hmm.
So if we can place the correct information on our channels on YouTube and endeavor strongly to change the worldview that we have in India, then we can make a difference despite the government not doing what it's supposed to do.
We come back to hard power, soft power. What we can do is soft power, but soft power
Yeah.
needs the seed has to be hard power. The government, the minute it, for example, says Jawaharlal Nehru University will be called Mauryan University, you will
Yeah.
have to study what is the Mauryan Empire about, or it calls any such big university as Indian Institute of Management. I'm giving you an example. Adds it to it one word, any word, Chola, Indian Institute of Management, Chola, this, or any other name. I'm not even getting into the names. It's just we are talking kingdom, so I'm saying this. We can have that. That hard power is needed. What we all can do is soft power, but we can't say
Yes.
this you have to learn, this you have to mug up to clear your examination, which you need to clear to get a job, and then it becomes embedded. Even if you do a job which is in sciences, you are a rare person, or in you become any other stream, you become an architect, you become a mathematician, you do any field, you would remember, oh, there was this Mauryan Empire where we were glorious. So that hard power, I'm thinking we are being soft on the government. They need to do the hard power bit. We can only do a soft power bit.
Yeah, we can contribute from our perspective. If the government puts even 10% more effort, then it's gonna really help the situation. So yeah, I think it is high time for the government to start focusing on culture. I know there are lots of enormous issues that we have to tackle, and the government, I'm sure, knows many things that we may not be knowing about, the kind of challenges our country is facing. And yet we do have ministries of culture and whatnot, the education and all that. So I think it is time that the government should get those people to do the work they are paid for. I mean, it's really high time for that. Changing a few names and getting some awareness is not a really hard thing to do.
It's just awareness. It spreads like the Mauryan Empire. So again, a very old empire. What was the era, and what would you say was the extent of it, and how it managed to the territories it managed to control and rule?
So the Mauryan Empire begins around the time of Chanakya, Vishnugupta Chanakya. Uh, that's around 400 BCE or thereabouts. I mean, the viewers can look up the exact dates. So it's around 400 BCE, and after that, it was in power at its greatest extent for like around 3 centuries or so, if not a little longer. After that, you had Pushyamitra Sunga and the Sunga Empire as well. So the Mauryans were one of the earliest in recorded history, in officially recorded history, one of the earliest empires to completely and almost fully integrate India into one political or geopolitical entity. Like, yeah, this map tells you that most of what we consider to be India today was under the aegis of this empire, and this is most likely during the time of Chandragupta Maurya, because he essentially entered into a conflict with Seleucus Nicator, who was the successor of Alexander. And there was a conflict for some time, and then they reached a kind of compromise. They had an interchange of they entered into a family relationship. Chandragupta agreed to marry his Seleucus Nicator's daughter, and they became relatives, and then they went in their own ways. So that's how the entire extent of the empire to the west was forged by by Chandragupta Maurya. And if you talk about Alexander, that also happened during the Mauryan times, because he arrived upon India's western boundaries when Chandragupta Maurya was in power in Patliputra, in present day Patna. Now, what we are taught about Alexander the Great is what the ancient Greek writers wrote about him. But when there are two sides who enter into a conflict, I think it behooves everybody to look at both sides, what they have to say, in order to arrive at a balanced picture of what happens. Right now, okay, we are taught the Greek version of what happened. Now let's take a look at the Indian version of what happened. What did the Indian historians of that time write about it? And what we find is that the Indian historians of the time did not write about Alexander at all. Like he did not matter, like he never existed. So it seems that to Indian eyes, this so-called incursion into the western boundary of India was a very minor matter. It did not seem to be such a big deal at all because nobody wrote about it. Now there is this event, the Great Battle of the Jhelum, which happened in Sapta Sindhu, in which Alexander fought with Purushottam, or so-called Porus, and
Was.
they say that he defeated Porus, right? He defeated Purushottam, and so on and so forth. So it's supposed to be this enormous, gigantic, apocalyptic battle in which the Greeks nearly lost, but because of their superiority, they defeated the Indians eventually. Now, this Purushottam or Porus, he seems to have been a very small, minor chieftain in the Sapta Sindhu region, Punjab region. Now, this battle happened in Punjab, in the Sapta Sindhu region, and we know that right nearby was this great university called Takshashila. It had so many scholars, historians, scientists, everybody came there from the world to get educated. Now, why is it, I ask you, why is it that these great scholars did not bother to write about this enormous battle that happened next door? Why is it? I want to ask this question to every official historian out there. Why did India's great scholars not write one word about this? Especially when the battle happened next door, why did they not mention Alexander's invasion at all when it happened right in Sapta Sindhu next to Takshashila?
The biggest king of the time, conquering empire comes at your door. That even in if you're afraid, you will write 20 things if you win, and it's a big significant thing. Alexander won. His court historians, his staff would conquer everything. They would reach there. Why would they stop and write? You're right. Why wouldn't they not write?
So why did our historians not write a single word about this? And our at that time, the mentor of the Indian emperor Chandragupta Maurya was Vishnugupta Chanakya, and Vishnugupta Chanakya had previously served as a professor of political science in Takshashila. So it's not like he would not have known what's happening. So why is it that the Indian historians and writers did not write one word about Alexander? It means that this guy did not do anything of significance. And it means that whatever the Greeks are writing and whatever we have been taught about his so-called conquest of India is all lies. And there was a great Russian military historian called Marshal Zhukov or something, who wrote precisely this in the 1960s. He wrote that that Alexander's so-called invasion of India was essentially a disastrous failure. It ended up costing Alexander his life. That is the true history. Now, I wonder why India's historians have not ever bothered in the past 70, 80 years to look at this question. So that tells us that they are all serving a certain agenda. They don't want us to understand what really happened. This one question that I asked you, it's going to raise up a lot of questions. So why doesn't this occur to any historian? That's my question.
Reality is, Porus was never a mighty empire. Was a small empire, not even an empire. Empire would be a wrong word. It was a small chieftain, right, or maybe a king with reasonable area. If he defeats the ruler of the world, which the Greeks very profoundly said, "Oh, ruler of the world." They would even Greeks would never even discuss much about Genghis Khan in Western universities. You would never read much about. Obviously, he was too big to be ignored, but never in the sense that Alexander was glorified. You would not see that level of glorification where they say from Greece to the Roman Empire, Caesar would talk about him, and then later things. Even though Genghis is much more recent. So the reality is, as you said, the minute you say that a small kingdom of India defeated the empire or halted the empire of Alexander, that again leads to glorification. So our history is only about the British history, and the Mughal history onwards is always about an attempt not to say India was glorious at any given time, because as you very rightly said, the minute you say we were glorious for 2000 years, the legitimate question would arise is, why are we not being ruled by people who are propagating our values, our cultural civilizational values, and why are we not great? That's a very
Precisely.
simple question to answer. And one small thing I remember when you say that why didn't they write, there's this very famous Sherlock Holmes story where some farmhouse is looted and there are dogs obviously it's a big farmhouse. Sherlock Holmes comes and says, what happened in the night? And then he sees the people say nothing, nobody made a noise. So he says, why the dog did not bark? He solves the mystery by saying if it was an outsider coming, a dog would bark. Right?
Absolutely.
The proof was as if some outsider had come. The police was investigating. They had called him because they could not figure out what happened. And he said, when the dog is not barking, and they had a kennel of, farmhouses are huge, these fierce dogs, doesn't bark, and the dog was not drugged, that means it was an inside job. So when university or scholars of that time do not talk about it, that means nothing significant happened. Or if it happened, he had a skirmish and Alexander lost, which they did not think worthy of getting much into debate because he was not an existent threat.
It essentially tells us that Alexander was no match even for a small border chieftain who lived
Hmm.
on the western boundaries, outskirts of the Indian subcontinent. That's what it tells us. So all this glorification that has been done, once you see it in the proper context, it fades into insignificance. It tells you that Alexander was no more than a petty robber who happened to stumble into some kind of greatness because he was able to conquer Persia somehow, because Persia had fallen on bad times apparently at that time. And even when he conquered Persia, he destroyed the city, the great city, Persepolis, in a night of drunken, misbehavior. And then the Greek historians attribute his drunkenness to some woman, because women are evil apparently. So that's the kind of history you see that's prevalent in the West, and that's accepted without question. So my point is we need to start questioning everything.
Well, that brings me to another person who conquered a lot of territory and in which you have a large video. So I did not thought I'll discuss that. But since we have come to Alexander, Genghis Khan, who also conquered large areas, India was a rich, ripe land. Maybe not ripe, but definitely a rich land. So why did his invasion not occur into India? What's the reason behind that?
So if we look at the map of Genghis Khan's empire, at its greatest extent, you see it includes everything from China to Central Asia to Iran and much of the Islamic heartland.
Hmm.
And the curious thing about this map is that India is somehow bypassed. It's like he's skirted over India. He doesn't want to get into India. It's a ridiculous map if you see it in the proper context. The first question that comes to your mind is, why the hell did this guy not go into India? It's sitting right there, and he was in the Sapta Sindhu region in the year 1221. He had come there pursuing one of the last king of the Khwarazm Empire, Jalaluddin. So the reason I mean, I've gone into this into a bit of detail in my video. The reason is very simple. There's a number of reasons. First of all, there was a rebellion in China that he had to put down, and the longer he waited outside outside China, the bolder the Chinese would get, and the greater would be the scale of the rebellion in China. That's one of the reasons. The second reason is that the Indians did not do anything to antagonize him. He invaded empires only when they had done him some harm. They had either hurt his national interest or done some sort of injury to Genghis Khan and the Mongols. So that's the only reason he used to invade. And what happened was that he ended up invading half of the known world at the time. But it was always in retaliation for something. And there was no aggression or injury to him or his country or his people from India, and therefore he saw no reason to invade India. And the same thing happens with Tibet. He passed through Tibet at least twice, and he did
Hmm.
not touch Tibet at all. So because again Tibet had given him no reason to be angry or to be upset with them. So that is the thing. And the third thing is that there is a cultural affinity. Now lots of people will say, no, you're speculating. The fact is that Buddhism has been present in Mongolia for around 2000 years. Mongolia today is a very, very Indianized country, even though they have that distinct culture, which is a mixture of Buddhism and Tengrism. And what we call Buddhism today has always been just one flavor of Dharma. This demarcation between Hinduism and Buddhism is a very recent origin. It is a Western creation for the sake of dividing and ruling India. Historically, over thousands of years, we have never seen a distinction between the various schools of thought of Dharma, whether it is Charvaka or Jaina or Bodha or Vaisheshika or Mimamsa or Vedanta or the others like Sankhya, Yoga, etc. These are various schools of thought of Indian philosophy. They have often been at odds with each other. They have very different worldviews, and yet they are all part of the same philosophical system, the same ancient 10,000 plus year old cultural tradition. And Bauddha Dharma is part of that. It is nothing special. It is not a separate religion. So, this is what was present in Mongolia for nearly 2000 years before today. And Genghis Khan was very much influenced by that. And I believe that one of the reasons why he did not invade India was that he did not want to inflict unnecessary collateral damage on the people of India, who were already ruled by bloodthirsty barbarians, genocidal barbarians. The Indians were already groaning under this foreign occupation. And if Genghis Khan were to conquer India for the sake of wealth, then he would end up slaughtering many people, because that's what happens. It's inevitable in warfare. And the core reason is that he was not motivated by wealth. He disdained wealth. All he wanted was power. His entire life history, if you study, he has never tried to be wealthy. Wealth came as a byproduct of power, but he only wanted power for himself and for his country, and that's what he pursued. So these are some of the reasons why he refused to invade India, even though he was at the doorstep of the world's richest country.
But Abhijit, that is exactly the point. The world's richest country, and as you are saying, China raised claim to South China Sea, where you say historically they were never controlling it, whereas historically Cholas were controlling it and their offshoots were controlling it. That is why it becomes so important to read it. Even Tibet, we just gifted it away, literally gifted away. Never staked a claim to it. Never brought out documents saying when we ruled it or when it was under our influence, or never even tried to make it an independent country. We just, because this is where history is important. Supposing everybody had known and believed Tibet is a part of India like Kashmir is, you would have probably had a lot of resistance to giving Tibet to China, political resistance, and politicians have to obey in a democracy the political resistance. Somebody would have stepped up. That is why we need to, or South China Sea, you would have objected to it then and there in 47 onwards that, okay, now we are independent. This is not their area of influence. China brings out 2,000-year-old things to say, this is our area of influence.
And those two are fabrications. Those are fabrications, you know.
Exactly. Fabrication to say this is our territory, this is our territory, this is our territory. If they have their way, they will say even US was 10,000 years ago our territory. And they will bring some university paper, university document, etc. And we, when we have it, we have influences there. We don't bring it. So that's a rotten state of affair which is affecting our current. That is why I say it's doubly important. But
I'll tell you something. Just one thing briefly. If you look at the life and career of Genghis Khan, there is one thing, one pattern that's common. After he became the great Khan of the Mongols, he did not fight a single war on his own home territory. He always fought wars outside. I think that's something we can learn from him. For the past 70, 80 years, we have been fighting inside our borders. It's time to take the fight outside to our enemies, don't you think?
Absolutely, I agree. Aggression, offense, the best form of defense. And for that, we need to know that we conquered West, that we were in China, that we were right up there to the Central Asia, to we were in Indonesia, to we were in, this Malaysia, Indonesia, all the other countries, Vietnam, etc. So how encompassing from every part of India, we were going away from India, conquering new territories. That I hope the audience, thank you for your time, has understood today deeply. And please, all of you, share it. And I will try to do this sometime soon on the Hindi channel also, so that we discuss these topics in depth because they affect your current. Thank you, Abhijit, so much for your time. It was a pleasure listening to all
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.